Williams called Reshaping the Work-Family Debate, Why Men and Class Matter. And we're really privileged to have the author with us today, and also to have with us Barbara Ehrenreich, who's another distinguished author in her own right, who's going to comment on the book. Before I introduce our speakers, let me just briefly say something about the Wilson Center. I know many of you have heard this rap before, but we still like to say it. The Wilson Center was established in 1968 as a living memorial to President Wilson, and it tries to embody in its mission and its spirit the two main dimensions of Wilson's life, which were the life, on the one hand, the life of a scholar, and of course, the other hand, the life of a policymaker and governor and president, someone who was in academic life and also in public life. And the idea behind the Wilson Center is to bring together academics and policymakers in creative and productive dialogue, and we try to do this in a lot of different ways. In U.S. studies, we're particularly interested in domestic issues and policy, social policy issues, and I'm personally interested in gender equity and gender rights, so this book was of great interest to me when I saw it in the Harvard catalog last summer, and I contacted the author Joan Williams and asked her to come and talk about her book here, so we're very pleased to have her with us today. Joan Williams is Distinguished Professor of Law, the 1066 Foundation Chair, and she holds the 1066 Foundation Chair, and she's the founding director of a very important institution at the University of California at Berkeley, the director of the Center for Work-Life Law. And this book, when she tells you about it, and if you have a chance to read it, you'll see it deals with a lot of issues that many of us have talked about for a long time, the work-family debate, the tension between work and family. But she brings to light dozens and dozens and dozens of legal cases, court cases, arbitrations, and so forth, that show how these issues have permeated many areas of the law, and particularly labor law, in the last few decades. So it's really an essential book, and one that's going to, I think, really reorient our thinking. In addition to that, well, as she'll tell you, and Barbara Ehrenreich, I'm sure, will comment, she focuses on the issue of on masculinity and ideas about masculinity and the role of men, and also on issues of class. These are two things that this debate often overlooks. Joan Williams has written many articles, over 50 law review articles and 4 books, and she organized a number of social scientists to talk about what she calls the maternal wall bias, and I hope she'll define that for us. And that was discussed in a special issue of the Journal of Social Issues that she co-edited with Monica Burnett and Faye Crosby in 2004, which one was a prize-winning special issue. She's also received the Margaret Brent Award for Women Lawyers of Achievement. Commenting on the book and trying and bringing this into larger and broader context is Barbara Ehrenreich, and I apologize, I see we have a typo in your name on our handout. But Barbara is well known, it's spelled correctly in the second line. Barbara is very well known to many of us as the author of a number of very, very important books. She's been a freelance writer for many, many years. She's also been a regular columnist for Time magazine, and she now publishes columns in a number of publications, including The Progressive, The New York Times, Mother Jones, The Atlantic Monthly, Ms., and The New Republic. Perhaps the book that's best known to many of you here is Nickeled and Dimed on Not Getting By in America, which gives new meaning to the term participant observation. Barbara went off and took a number of low-wage jobs for many months at a time so that she could write about it from her firsthand experience, and it's truly a gripping book and really an important document for our times. Her most recent book is called Bait and Switch, The Futile Pursuit of the American Dream. And she's been documenting American life from her own unique perspective for many years, and is really a very valuable member of the American literary scene and the nonfiction scene. So the format will be as follows. Joan Williams will discuss the book, discuss the background of the book and the main themes and issues that she deals with in it for about 25 minutes or half an hour, and then Barbara will comment, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. So once again, welcome to all of you. Thanks for being here, and we now turn to Joan Williams. Thank you.
I want to first thank Sonia Michel for inviting me to the Wilson Center, and to say to Barbara Ehrenreich how honored I am that she is here with us today. She has influenced my work for, 20, 30 years, so I'm extremely honored to meet her. 10 years ago, the accepted wisdom was that the key economic agenda for American feminism was to get women in traditionally male, quote, good jobs, and that the key outrage was that women were discriminated against even when they behaved in exactly the same way as men in jobs traditionally held by men. In my book on Bending Gender, I took the radical step of acknowledging that women's economic vulnerability stemmed in significant part from motherhood. In response to the argument that motherhood only represented women's choice, I said, yes, it does represent women's choice, but that choice typically takes place within a framework set by discrimination. I began with the premise that good jobs are designed in ways that discriminate against women because they still define the ideal worker as someone who starts to work in early adulthood and works full-time, full force for 40 years straight, taking no time off for childbearing, child rearing, or anything else. Who does that describe? It describes men, and in fact, to this day, many good jobs are designed around men's bodies and men's traditional life patterns. When good jobs, was the argument of Bending Gender, when good jobs are designed around men and masculinity, that's not equality, that's sex discrimination. And in that context, what women need is not accommodation. They need simple gender equality. But the first step in attaining gender equality is to replace that old-fashioned notion of the ideal worker with a new norm of a balanced worker, someone who needs to balance work obligations with responsibilities in family life. Based on that theory and with generous support from some of the largest foundations in the country, I created the Center for Work-Life Law, which organized social scientists for the first time to study gender discrimination not against women in general, but against mothers in particular. And what we found was dramatic. Discrimination triggered by motherhood is the single strongest form of gender discrimination in today's workplace. In the leading study, researchers compared identical resumes. One, but not the other, listed membership in the PTA, signaling that she was a mother. And what they found is that the mothers were almost 80% less likely to be hired, 100% less likely to be promoted, offered an average of $11,000 less in salaries, and held to higher performance and punctuality standards. And my friend Shelley Carell, who did this, called me up and said, "Joan, this is great. Look at these effect sizes. They're so large." And Shelley has no kids, and I sort of said, "Shelley," and I have 2 kids, "these effect sizes are kind of great, but they're kind of depressing." Using that social science, the Center for Work-Life Law pointed out that when workplaces are designed around men and masculinity, gender stereotyping arises in everyday workplace interactions. And in 2007, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission adopted Work-Life Law's theory about how these cases could be litigated and christened really what had been going on by then for a decade, which is one of the most rapidly growing areas of employment law, which we call family responsibilities discrimination. The result, and so that is sort of the impact in many ways of the book that I wrote 10 years ago on Bending Gender. And yet, employment law is an extremely awkward tool with which to address work-family conflict. Reshaping the work-family debate attempts to nudge American culture along several new paths in an attempt to help Americans balance work and family. And the book has 3 basic messages. The first is that work-family conflict has never come into its own as a national issue, because for too long it's been depicted as an issue of professional women opting out. This picture represents only one of the 3 faces of work-family conflict. The second face is of low-paid workers with rotating shifts whose schedules are set only a week in advance. the mothers in these low-paid jobs have lots of workplace flexibility, but it's called quitting. If the baby gets sick or if grandma's sick, the only way to balance work and family is to quit, not once, but over and over and over again, thereby dooming the entire family to a permanent diet of dead-end jobs. The third phase of work-family conflict is, in fact, the more common, because the two that I've mentioned, that of the poor, the bottom 30% of families, and that of the professional families, the top 13% of families, overlooks what I call the missing middle, the 53% of American families who are neither poor nor rich. These families have a median income of roughly $65,000. Both parents work, and child care is typically handled by tag teaming, where mom works one shift and dad works the other shift. 1 in 3 American families with small children handle child care in this way, and when they do, many men as well as women are one sick child away from being fired. And so that's the first major message of my book. The book's second goal is to explore why the workplace leaves and flexibility policies offered by U.S. corporations and U.S. public policy so often marginalize the people who use them. That's related to the question of why American women have been so unsuccessful in bargaining for gender equality in the family. American women still do 4 times as much routine housework and 3 times as much child care as men do. And the standard argument in American feminism blames women for not bargaining more effectively within the family to change that. Reshaping the work-family debate argues that women are fated to fail at that kitchen table bargaining unless and until we open up a national conversation about gender pressures on men. Men today report actually higher levels of work-family conflict than women do. Many now have new caregiving responsibilities, and meanwhile, they remain under gender pressures that stem from old ideals. Here's a quote: "Guys try to out-macho each other, but in engineering, it's really perverted because out-machoing someone means being more of a nerd. It's not like being a brave firefighter or going up one more flight than your friend," said one Silicon Valley engineer. So much of the macho in professional managerial jobs involves long hours. Quote, "He's a real man. He works a 50-hour week," said one engineer. "I actually think it's for the benefit of the other men," the guy continued. Masculinity is precarious, according to social psychologists, and has to be proven over and over and over. Take the example of the factory worker who refused to work overtime because he had to get home to care for his grandson. He was tag teaming with his son. So the factory worker's supervisor asked him, "Well, why do you have to get home? If you have a reasonable excuse, then I can exempt you from your need to work overtime." This grandfather refused to say why he had to leave, and he simply left. The supervisor said, "Can't you tell me?" And the guy said, "No, it's none of your business." And so he was ordered to stay, and he left, and so was fired for insubordination. Now, this guy was lucky. He had a union, so he was ultimately reinstated. Of course, 82% of American workers in the private sector don't have a union. But the real question here is, why would someone prefer to be fired rather than admit that they had caregiving responsibilities? For working men to admit that they have to go home for child care would be, to quote anthropologist Pete Richardson, as embarrassing as what Pete called a loud fart at church. Why? Perhaps it reflects embarrassment that class disenfranchisement means that those working men now fall short of the breadwinning ideal. And embarrassment isn't the half of it. Studies consistently find that men who take even a short family leave are penalized more than women who themselves are penalized. So a man who takes even a short family leave is recommended for fewer promotions and has fewer work rewards than a man who takes no leave. These men who are taking leaves or leaving for childcare because of childcare responsibilities are flouting what Mary Blair Loy has called the work devotion mandate, which she describes as the ideal worker who has to demonstrate commitment by making work the central focus of their lives and manifest a singular devotion to work, unencumbered by family responsibilities. In other words, today, still, the ideal worker is a breadwinner whose first and only time demand is from his job. So long as that's true, any kind of leave, parental leave or any kind of leave, and certainly using any flexible work arrangement, will remain stigmatized. And so long as that's true, women will continue to lose at kitchen table bargaining. And we'll continue to lose at the attempt to get men to 50-50 until we open up a conversation about gender pressures on men. And that's the book's second goal. Its third is even more ambitious. And that's to examine why the U.S. has the most family-hostile public policy in the entire developed world. You've probably heard the statistic that there are only 4 nations in the entire world who lack paid maternity leave. They're Papua New Guinea, Swaziland, Botswana, and the United States of America. We also lack subsidized child care, universal pre-K, child and elder care daycare programs, paid sick leave, limits on mandatory overtime, the right to work part-time parity, and the right to request workplace flexibility. All of those exist elsewhere. And the reason is simple. The new work-family reconciliation laws, if you think about them, what they involve are social subsidies and new workers' rights. The sharp swing to the right in American politics has made it absolutely impossible to pass either one. And as a result, in the 10 years since I wrote Unbending Gender, although there has been a boom in litigation over work-family conflict, exactly nothing has happened in federal public policy on work-family issues. And in fact, nothing has happened in the 17 years since we passed the Family and Medical Leave Act in 1993, and the Obama administration, no legislation is expected out of the Obama administration either. No work-family legislation is feasible unless and until progressives turn around the swing to the right that occurred in American politics after 1973. And so the final chapters of the book re-examined that shift, and the result is a novel analysis. What I argue is that the swing to the right in American politics stems from a broken relationship between professional managerial progressives and the white working class. And just a note as to why my focus is on the white working class, because I'm trying to figure out why we can't pass this legislation, and African Americans have always voted Democratic. They're sort of, I won't characterize who's smarter than whom, but it's the white working class that has bolted the New Deal coalition. America became strikingly more conservative when the Democrats lost a key constituency, and that's white workers. The percentage of white working class voters who identified as Democratic fell from 60% to 40% in the 20 years after the mid-1970s. George W. Bush received approximately 2/3 of white working class men's votes, both in 2000 and in 2004, and Barack Obama gained even fewer of those votes than Kerry did. The common explanation for this is racism, and that is no doubt part of the problem. But I think it's not all of it. I think there's a class component as well, best illustrated in terms of the shift from On the Waterfront and Grapes of Wrath on the one hand, and All in the Family, remember Archie Bunker from All in the Family, and Homer Simpson on the other. The first two celebrate the white working class men as noble, sexy, oppressed. Remember Tom Joad and all the Jesus metaphors associated with Tom Joad. Or if you go around and look at the WPA murals throughout the country, they celebrate, they are anti-oppression, and the people who they place at the center of that are white working class men. Now, Archie Bunker and Homer Simpson present a very different image. Archie Bunker was narrow-minded and racist, as well as sexist. Homer Simpson, quote, and here I quote the great Wikipedia, Homer Simpson embodies several American working-class stereotypes. He is crude, overweight, incompetent, clumsy, thoughtless, and a borderline alcoholic. Memoirs of class migrants, typically academics who were born working class and then have entered professional managerial jobs, recall open class affronts. It's striking to me, noted one, that faculty who would never use a racial slur refer to, quote, trailer trash or white trash to my face. So the first step in mending the relationship between progressives and the white working class is to stop the insults. We sorely need the kind of rigorous taboo that lists against racial innuendo, jokes, and insults. Homer Simpson is the step and fetch it of our time. What's the matter with Kansas, which argues that a gullible Kansas has been duped, in my view, is comfort food for the class clueless. A deeper point, though, is that the class conflicts have dominated American politics since 1970, often understood as culture wars. Understanding this dynamic requires an understanding of how class is defined through cultural differences in food, social networks, child-rearing, and leisure. Compare, for example, Red Lobster, which incidentally was the restaurant of choice among Hillary Clinton voters, all those white working class folks, to Chez Panisse from my neck of the woods, the iconic restaurant of the Berkeley elite. Well, for one thing, working class folks simply can't fathom why someone would pay so much for the tiny amounts of food they put on your plate in Chez Panisse. Chez Panisse, to the working class people, the incredible number of choices on the large menu at Red Lobster, the bounteous portions of basically food produced by the industrial agricultural complex is what signifies luxury. Luxury for them entails bounty and choice, just what Red Lobster offers. Chez Panisse signals something very different. It signals what professional managerial people value. It's an enactment of human capital, in thinking up a new way of cooking, in figuring out how to farm without fertilizer, in finding just the perfect broad bean in the farmer's market. The class culture gap extends beyond lifestyle, though, to a clash of moral visions. Family comes first is a truism of working class life that signals workers' belief that people higher in the pecking order have seriously skewed priorities. Working class whites paint professionals as people obsessed with their jobs at the expense of family life. I don't know why they should think we were obsessed with our jobs. In sharp contrast, working class men measure their success by having, quote, good kids, kids who keep out of trouble, and a stable life. Writing is what makes me happy, one class migrant reporter said to his father. No, his father corrected him. You're happy with your family. He noted, this is a key blue-collar rule. White workers compare themselves favorably not only to those above them on the pecking order, but also to those below, based on their distinction between hard living and settled living. Whereas settled families focus on order, self-discipline, and respect for authority, think lace curtain Irish. Hard living families tend towards drugs, anti-authoritarianism, and spontaneity. I always say the hard living youth is the kind of youth who, if he were a little luckier, would quit college and go sailing around the world on a sailboat. Settled families' existence has no room for that. They are very focused on the straight and narrow and their disapproval of hard living because of exactly what Barbara Ehrenreich several decades ago called the fear of falling. She was talking about the fear of falling of the professional managerial class, and that exists. It's expressed in terms of the feeding frenzy about getting into Yale and Harvard. That's the fear of falling in that class. Among white workers, the fear of falling focuses them on a ordered, settled, perhaps a narrow, but a very predictable life. Settled families' insistence on what Michel Lamont called the disciplined self helps explain why family values became the third rail of American politics. Quite simply, psychologically healthy people put their eggs in baskets they can fill. For the white working class, this has meant a respect for family, for the disciplined self, and for authority, including traditional religion, military, and family values. The resulting political dynamic has left progressives baffled. Robert Frank and others have pointed out that Republicans simply do not have white workers' best interests at heart. Absolutely true. On the other hand, what Frank and others overlook is that Republicans have gone out of their way to signal respect for the culture and values of the white working class at a time when progressives did not. The result has been a series of class affronts that have helped drive many American workers into the Republican camp, perhaps on the theory that neither party had their economic interests at heart and that at least Republicans signaled respect for their cultural values and promised to stop taxing them for what, in their view, were social programs focused on hard-living, irresponsible families. Democrats unfortunately fed this dynamic to the significant extent we have settled on needs-based social programs that channeled benefits chiefly to the poor. That makes perfect sense when we can hardly get anything. On the other hand, those social programs set off acute class conflict by excluding people only a little bit richer. And so they set off fights between the have-a-littles and the have-nots. In conclusion, Unbending Gender tackled the easy problem, how to mobilize the language of anti-discrimination to address work-family conflict in the U.S. Reshaping the work-family debate seeks to build tools that are much harder to wield, but ultimately will be more effective. It seeks to reshape corporate flexibility policies by pointing out that they will remain marginalized and stigmatized until we change gender pressures on men. And it seeks to pave a path towards work-family legislation by repairing the broken relationship between professional managerial progressives and the white working class as the first step towards creating the political will to pass the kind of social subsidies and workers' rights that are vital if the U.S. is to cede its place as the most family-hostile developed nation in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan, for giving us a really good sense of the richness of the book. Barbara?
Should I get up there?
Whichever you prefer.
I'll get up so I can see you better. Thank you very much for this book, Joan. This is really important, and I'm going to steal from it again and again. I'll just let you know. Huh? Okay.
That is a high compliment.
No, because I often still go around and talk about my book Nickel and Dimed, and I have often felt a little bit guilty that when I was working in those low-wage jobs, I was not really doing a very good job of replicating the experience of so many working-class women because I didn't have children with me. Tried to get my kids to come with me when I went and lived in these trailer parks and things, but they weren't interested. But, it's just much more typical than a, say, middle-aged woman, single woman going into the workforce on her own is, and I hope I'm right about the numbers here, is a woman with a child or two to take care of as well as to support. Now, what I try to emphasize when I'm talking to people as recently as week before last in North Dakota State University is that the problem here is not about ideology, family values, anything like that. It's a problem of arithmetic. And you can just do the math. If you are, say, a single mother and you have one child, two children, and one of them is in child care, and you are making about $8 an hour, forget it. You're going to be in the red before you pay for groceries. You can't do, you can add up, as many scholars have done, you can add up the numbers, what it takes for rent, utilities, very minimal lifestyle, no luxuries, no vacations, no Christmas presents, and it does not work out. Then you add to that something which I am really, happy that Joan emphasizes so much in her book, is the fact that it's so easy to be fired for even missing one day of work because of a sick child. And many, even what's not a single mother, if there's two parents, still it's a hard choice. When you get up in the morning and one child has a fever of 103, they will not take that child in a daycare center if that's what you have. They're just, if you cannot leave that child alone. I wonder if we have any numbers it would be possible to get any numbers on the number of parents, probably mostly women, who are fired or lose jobs for that reason.
There are a lot, because I've read a lot of union arbitrations where people get fired for exactly
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I think that should be illegal. You can't fire people for taking care of their children. Then if we look at the role of the state in this, of the government, it doesn't get a whole lot better. With welfare reform in 1996, we lost any recognition in this country that caregiving, taking care of children, is an effort, is work. And we just said, not we, I don't include myself in this we. I mean, the government just said, you go out and get a job because you are, quote, not working. Often with absolutely no provision for child care at all in that situation. As you try to fulfill work requirements, like there's a case that came to my attention that an academic had brought up in Michigan of a woman who goes to TANF, gets onto, that's temporary assistance to needy families, gets on it, is told she can't get any money from TANF unless she has a job. So she gets a job at Target as a cashier. But there's no child care. So she brings her 4-year-old daughter with her to work and puts her on a stool next to her at the cash register. So she's fired for that. And then because she's lost her job, she loses her TANF grant. Figure that out. It's just these terrible knots, these catch-22s that working mothers are put into. Then I hadn't even thought of this one before until I did, some interviewing research last summer. But there's this constant fear of losing your children. You can't leave. I mean, even if you thought the children would do fine by themselves, parked in front of the TV for a few hours, if, this could be what is it called? Neglect, and then you could have your children taken away. One particularly poignant case that came to my attention is a woman a married woman, had gotten on TANF, husband is disabled. They could not afford, they could not afford any more than a one-bedroom apartment. They had 3 children. But they were convinced that in Delaware, the state they were in, they would lose their children if they were found to have a boy older than 5 sleeping in the same bedroom as little girls. Apparently there are rules to that effect. They all slept on mattresses in the living room, which was the only functioning room that they had. But that terror, you try to make money, you try to do things to economize and everything, that you could be crossing a line and then you lose your children. I can't sufficiently express my own indignation at all of this, and I'm glad to have Joan sharing it and going out and talking about these things. So we're really getting to a point where the working class, to use sort of a Marxist term, cannot reproduce itself. If you can't raise your children and feed your children at the same time, there's not a next generation of workers. I want to add that, and this is from my work in another book that you mentioned, Sonia, Bait and Switch, that there are also tremendous penalties among professional and managerial class women. For my book, Bait and Switch, I went undercover as a white-collar corporate job seeker. And I thought I could fake this because I would just say why my resume was kind of empty by saying I have stayed home to raise my children. And now here I am, And I was very quickly told by career coaches and in all these kinds of networking sessions, do not ever mention that. It is like embarrassing. It is shameful. Motherhood is a blot on your record. I always had the idea you could say, hey, I was president of a PTA committee, and then, they'd see your managerial qualities. But no, anyway. So I think the challenge, really, that you are setting to us, Joan, is can we bridge the kind of class divides here between working class and more professional class people, and women in particular, but also men, to push for real change on these completely family hostile sorts of policies. I don't think this is going to be easy. In the professional and managerial class, people not only have different kinds of jobs, often more rewarding, but they can solve child care problems with nannies. In the working class, especially the immigrant working class, women often are nannies who are taking care of somebody else's children while, their children try to, maybe a grandma is taking care of them. Now, I think so. I'm putting that out as a challenge. How do we bridge that class divide? And I think here's where I would maybe provoke a little discussion with you, Joan. I think that the white working class is way beyond the Archie Bunker or even the Homer Simpson kinds of stereotypes. That, in the 80s we had deindustrialization, a vast outsourcing of so many of those jobs that did allow for a, quote, traditional family with a stay-at-home wife and a full-time working husband, because you still had union jobs that paid enough so a man could do that. That's gone. And I don't think you'll find a lot of white working class men or working class men of any color being nostalgic for some time when their wives would stay home. It's very difficult, unless of course the cost of child care is just too great. I think the working class and white working class too is a lot more sophisticated than those stereotypes suggest. There's the internet, for one thing, which has been a kind of an educational leveler. You know, you can get information. You can, when there were still jobs in computing, you could get them without a lot of education. And I would add, suppose they're not. Suppose that these stereotypes hold true of the white working class, especially the males within it. Where does that put me as a sort of a professional type radical? Do I drop subjects like gay rights when I talk to the white working class people in my family? Do I stop? Do I not mention or occasionally point out the racism of some of the people in my extended family? No, I can't. It's not going to be a dialogue. We're not going to build bridges like that. You know, and I don't think it's anyway quite as polarized, perhaps, as your book presents, and we can talk about that. The other part of this is the professional managerial class. When I first wrote about it in the 70s, it seemed to me that their relative privilege compared to the working class was really clear in salary, in security, in the amount of authority that they exercised at work. I need to update that, what I had wrote, say, in Fear of Falling. It has really changed. We have seen a steady churning out of, say, corporate white-collar workers with college educations. You know, they have been huge victims of downsizing, not the only victims. It's much more the working class initially, anyway. But downsizing, I would mention that the sort of more liberal so-called professions, like in academia, the jobs aren't there anymore. It's terrible insecurity. And if I may self-servingly mention journalists and people like myself, it's over. You know, we have in 2 or 3 years seen the end of an entire way that we lived, worked, made a living, and so on. I don't mean to be apocalyptic, but I think what's happening is apocalyptic. So maybe those things I'm saying right now and trying to provoke you a little bit on do suggest, though, that some basis for the unity around these issues. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Barbara. Joan, have you been provoked? Do you want to respond a little bit?
I have been intrigued, not provoked. First of all, on the issue of the professional managerial class, Barbara and I are the only 2 people in the world who use that term. We're looking for a better one. If anybody has one, we're right here. But I wrote a report actually last year for which an economist crunched numbers. I assume they were 2008 or 2009 numbers. And if those numbers showed that the top 13% of families in the United States, if you looked at the top 13% of families where at least one member had a 4-year college degree, those folks had an average annual income, I think it was $128,000 a year. That's who I'm defining as the professional managerial class. The missing middle had a median income of about $65,000 a year. And so I do think there is, we often hear people talking about people like me as middle class. But if you look at it demographically, we're not middle class. We're the rich. And I do think that that's a very important thing for Americans to come to terms with, because I think it's very divisive when an elite does not know it's an elite. Another thing and I think this is certainly true, if it's true that white working class folks are very different and have a very different culture than professional managerial class people do, does that mean that we drop abortion rights, drop gay rights, drop all of it? No, of course not. It doesn't. But what I think of it as, if you're at Thanksgiving dinner with your Aunt Bertha, who you know you disagree with, What do? You choose your words carefully because you know that you have to live with your Aunt Bertha. And that's what the professional managerial class has not done. It's not said, look, class creates cultural differences, and I need to be talking carefully across cultural differences to maintain a tone of respect for people who are less privileged than I do. And I think that's what we haven't done as professional managerial progressives. And I think the Republicans, frankly, have spent a lot of time on that issue. And frankly, I think they do it brilliantly.
Could we just, for a minute, bring it back to the topic of your book, the Reshaping Work-Family Debate? Could you link, why is it important, or how, I assume that you think it is important to bridge the class divide in order to create some kind of policies that are going to alleviate the work-family conflict. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
The policies that we need to alleviate work-family conflict consist of social subsidies. For example, subsidized child care, paid leave, subsidized adult daycare centers, those kinds of things. We don't do social subsidies right now, and we haven't for the last 30 years. They consist also of workers' rights, the part-time parity, the right to limits on mandatory overtime, mandatory vacation, frankly, those sorts of things. We don't do workers' rights, and we haven't for the past 30 years. And one of the things that, I'm a big Obama girl, have been since Iowa, but these are not on the radar screen of the Obama administration either. And I think it's because politically they're too heavy a lift. And why are they too heavy a lift? Because we don't have the coalition we need in order to accomplish them. So having waited for 10 years and seen exactly nothing on the work-family legislative arena, I had to go deep and say, what is it going to take to get these kind of political subsidies and workers' rights? And in my opinion, this is what it's going to take. It's going to take reshaping American politics at a very profound level, because I think American politics has been driven by class conflict between the white working class and professional managerial progressives since about 1976.
Not to put too fine a point on that. Well, you've all been very patient. I could pursue this line of questioning for a while, but I'd like to hear what you folks have to say. Steve, wait for the mic and identify yourself, please.
My name is Stephen Shore. I agree with your analysis and share your blue sympathies, but the question is, what incentive is there for any the Democratic Party to promise benefits to a group of voters who largely have deserted it and gone in other avenues, or if you wish, whoring after false gods of gun ownership and banning abortion? And the Republicans are not going to promise social benefits under any circumstances. But why would the Democrats run on a platform of benefits for a group of voters that largely have gone to the other party?
I'm not saying that the Democrats should promise benefits to these voters. First of all, promising benefits to these voters would just make them really angry, because they are convinced that the government is evil, and the government will never give them anything that's worth having. What I'm talking about is shifting the conversation at a deeper level, and number one, stopping the class insults, and then number two, learning how to talk across cultural difference. Just look at the language that you've chosen, whoring after false gods. This is a very harsh characterization. I do think that I think big guns are a part of my book. I talk about big guns. Why do people lust after big guns? Well, if you have a culture that is systematically, if you looked at the wages of high school educated men recently, they go like that. And so there is considerable anxiety about masculinity, not only among professional managerial men, but also among white working class men. And I just leave the rest of the metaphor about guns to you.
But is there, just to follow up on this, I mean, is there a kind of a catch-22 here? That is, these men who are anxious about their jobs and anxious about their ability to support their families are, in fact, increasingly having to depend on the wages of their spouses.
That's right.
So is it the case that if you say to them, look, we could make your life easier with some basic provisions like paid childcare and paid maternity leave. I mean, is it impossible to say that? Is that just trigger?
It's not possible to say it, but they'll say big government, forget it. I mean, I think that's why the solutions I have are that to solve this political problem, we need to begin to open a couple of different conversations. One is about gender pressures on men. I mean, I agree with you, Barbara, that the breadwinner ideal is over in practice. The problem is that it's not over in imagination. It still holds the imaginations of most men. There are few professional managerial, Gen Y, and millennial men who are letting go of it. That's the good news. But for working class men, I think, for basically for 2 generations, working class men could have the mother at home. Now, the housewife was invented in the 19th century as a way of signaling class arrival. That's why the housewife was invented. It was invented as a signal of middle class status. And not to mention that our entire economy is set up around having a housewife. Given that the housewife was invented around middle-class status, that masculinity is very much intertwined with playing the provider role, until we open up conversations about masculinity, there's really 2 choices, and I've said this to union leaders. We need to take this out of the box. Remember the grandpa who wouldn't admit that he was a tag teamer? We need to take this out of the box of, I can't support my family, I'm so embarrassed and humiliated, and put it into the box of, just because the boss gave me a job doesn't mean I can't put my family first. That is a new framework for masculinity. Now, it's a framework that gets us where we want to go, but it's a framework that acknowledges where the men start.
Yes, over here.
Hi, my name's Alex Corey, and I'd actually like to ask you, although at face value I agree with you that expanding workers' rights and benefits for workers from specifically the companies that employ them sounds good, I just wonder if that could perhaps pose a risk in the loss of more American jobs, specifically those of the working class and the white working class, to outsourcing or other countries overseas, and if perhaps it's better to have a job with somewhat less benefits than to not have a job at all because of that.
I'd like to hear what Barbara has to say about this. I actually don't believe that, and I'm not talking about having companies give workers' rights. I'm talking about having governments give workers' rights, just to make clear what I'm talking about. But I don't think that would jeopardize the economy at all. And the reason is that I don't think the way that businesses are run right now is responsive to the bottom line or indeed economically rational. The 21st century workplace is still based on the assumption that a worker is always available for work and takes no time off for childbearing or childrearing. So the 21st century workplace is perfectly designed for the workforce of the 19th century. That makes no sense. All I am asking businesses to do is to design the 21st century workplace to fit the 21st century workforce. Now, it takes a leap of imagination, but if they could make that leap, what they would find is that they wouldn't have unbelievably high rates of turnover among low-wage workers, for example. A lot, not all, but a lot of that turnover among low-paid workers in the United States stems from childcare breakdowns. Because those folks have a lot of work-family flexibility, but it's called quitting. That makes no more sense for employers than it makes for families.
Well, I would just point out, though, some major employers actually encourage turnover because they don't want people sticking around and seeing any incremental addition to their wages. In fact, that's why Walmart capped its wages that you can ever make. But until they had done that, yeah, okay, the turnover doesn't bother them that much, actually, because they don't bother training people. You know, you're there, and if you don't survive for 3 days because you don't figure it out fast enough, you're out. It's really the situation. But I would say to you, this is a class struggle issue. Now, you could make an argument that any improvement we argue for in the condition in working people's lives, and I'd say working people to mean like everybody here, like that they should have a lunch break or they should be able to go to the bathroom during the workday. You can make an argument that that's not going to be good for the company. The company would have higher profits if they did not even have restrooms in the building. The company could always go to Papua New Guinea or one of those places and find people who will put up with those situations. This is about drawing the line and saying, no, we will not be hostage forever to what you claim about your profits. And I think Joan just made a really good point that it's not even that they turned out to have been operating in any kind of rational way, even in a narrow capitalist sense. The whole thing blew up on them.
But Joan, I think in the book you make some arguments that actually having worker-friendly or family-friendly policies is actually good for productivity.
Yes, that's why. Because it cuts down on attrition, and attrition is extremely expensive for employers.
So you don't necessarily agree with Barbara.
Well, I think in
No, I
the
think we
different
both
jobs,
agree.
I think in
Oh,
some of the really
actually-
low-paid jobs, really, it's Darwinian. And I've been in these jobs, and you're there, and if you're back the next day, good. Try for another day. But they know there's so many people waiting for every job. They don't care.
There's two management strategies. I mean, one management strategy is the one that Barbara's talking about, which is that let's keep everybody in the lowest pay grade, period. The other management strategy is let's treat every worker with dignity and say every job is important, try to drive down our labor costs by decreasing attrition and cross-training, et cetera. So there's two very distinctive management strategies for people who deal with low-wage workers or, in fact, any workers.
So we've got the class divide again.
No, these are all capitalists. The two sets of capitalists just have different business strategies.
But the kinds of jobs that Barbara's talking about are working class jobs, and the kind of jobs that you're probably talking about are PMC.
No, I'm talking, well, of course, the let's drive down, the kind of jobs I'm talking about, that management strategy is more common in PMC jobs than it is among low-wage jobs, but there are some employers who also apply it in low-wage contexts.
Back there?
Hi, I'm Elavi Ndura Wedrago. I'm a professor, associate, not professor yet, at George Mason University, and I'm a new fellow here. This is only my second week. I'm quite intrigued, and Barbara, I have used your book in my teacher education course to explore issues of poverty. What's intriguing to me, I'm an immigrant with children. When I took my first full-time assistant professor position, the very first research article that I read about the likelihood of success in academia concluded that the people who were the least likely to succeed in academia were single women of color raising children. And I looked at myself and wondered why I had left my tenured position as a teacher in public schools to move on to full-time academia. But I think we live in complete hypocrisy in our institutions and in our society in general. We live like we don't hear and we don't see. Maybe that's why even the language we use to communicate with each other in our workplace, in our families, are condescending, to say the least. So my question is, and of course, all institutions and many companies, we say where we are, we follow the policies. That, you know, if you have a child, you're welcome to take days off, unpaid. No one really talks to you about, okay, if you can take the 6 weeks off, what's that going to do to your rent? And how are you going to feed that kid that you're taking care of while you're not being paid? These are serious issues. And how can we engage our companies, our institutions of higher education in honest dialogue? Because right now we're really not being honest. We expect everybody to do so much, even when you take a semester off, a few weeks off, when your dossier comes up for evaluation for promotion or tenure, guess what? They will not forgive you for the few months that you take off to raise the new child. Your dossier will be just, you know, looked at the same way as the men's who never had to take time off. How do we engage our institutions in honest dialogue to actually be ourselves, and instead of, you know, living what I consider to be really a fake and untrue life where we keep pretending I'm this, oh yes, I'm smart, I'm hardworking, I want to be promoted, I want to be a manager at Walmart and so forth. How do we reclaim the right to be truthful to the actual life that we are living in this country? Because until we get there, we will not be able to solve any of the problems.
I mean, the problem is bad for professors. It's even worse for example, women in low-wage jobs who have no sick leave. I mean, they're put in the position of lying or losing their jobs. And as Barbara pointed out, if you're in that situation and you lose your job, the next step is losing your home, and the next step may be losing your children. And as I always say when I'm talking to employers, if that was my situation, I would lie. Who are we helping here?
Yes, over here.
Sue Marksmock. Some of the corporations are now what we call, quote, family friendly. Some in Silicon Valley. I guess the ideal Zappo, maybe, Zappo Corporation, and they're now doing studies of these. Do you think that this might spread, since they make a good profit, and that's the bottom line, and they're claiming they make a better profit by being what I call family friendly? Might that spread?
Well, for the past 25, 30, actually 35 years, you have these lists of the most family-friendly countries, companies in America. And a lot of people spending a lot of time doing what I've done today called the business case for workplace flexibility, where you say, oh, you're going to improve your bottom line. The problem is that has had it's had important impact. It's had a very limited impact. That's one of the reasons why 10 years ago I and founded the Center for Work-Life Law and added a stick to that carrot, so that now we say, oh, you could enhance your profits, and oh, by the way, part of enhancing your profits is eliminating the risk you're going to get sued because you're discriminating against mothers. But the problem is how you you enable Americans to balance their work and family lives. These corporate policies inevitably will be focused on professional managerial workers, because that is where the corporations generally focus their benefits. There are also very practical constraints. I mean, one of the ways to create a family-friendly workplace is paid maternity leave. Who knew it? What an idea. That's really not very practical to finance at an enterprise level. Certainly not very practical for a small business. It's really some larger businesses do it, but every single country in the world that has paid leave finances it at a national level. And that is that's the only way it's going to work. So, I mean, the Center for Work-Life Law, we actually have a whole website on best practice, family-friendly policies for academic institutions. And the best way to get it is actually to Google gender-biased bingo, because it's part of our gender-biased bingo game, which you should all play.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we are over here, yeah.
Hi, I'm Yvette Richards. And I think that we, as a country, have a problem with language. Well, the Democrats in particular have a problem with language, and the Republicans are good at it. How can they take class warfare and turn it around to mean that the rich are oppressed? Right. How can they take, how can...
You got to admire it,
It's just amazing. And how can they take... or how can we talk about needs-based programs and have people who are working class not think it pertains to them? And, and what can we do about a corporate media culture that does not interrogate this language? And as long as that's not happening on a massive level, on a level where most people get their news, it's not going to happen on Fox News, but it's not going to happen on the other networks where they really interrogate this language. And if the Democrats don't step forward and interrogate it and also just completely overturn it, then I don't see how we're going to get anywhere, because I think the problem, if people were given a more clear vision of how work can be restructured, and in the back of their minds they aren't thinking evil socialism, then they might go for it. Yeah. But already corporate America has primed a lot of America to think that any benefit that they get is undeserved and is socialism.
Well, on the other hand, corporations were pretty strong in the 1930s, and in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, we had a robust language of social justice that was mobilizing a working coalition, and then we lost it. Now, I don't have all the answers, but I think that's the agenda, in my view. I think the Republicans have done and the conservatives have done a brilliant job at mobilizing language and reframing things in a way Americans can hear. All I'm saying is that the Democrats and the progressives need to do the same. Just a specific example. Why haven't I heard every 3 days for the past 2 years that guess who brings you your unemployment? Compliments of the U.S. government. This recession has presented such a missed opportunity for Democrats to begin to change the imagery of government in this country. And I'm not saying that, Obama and the rest haven't had a lot in their hands. They've had a lot in their hands. But I have been shocked at that lost opportunity.
I just, add or maybe nitpick a little bit. I do not think we can completely conflate the white working class with the constituency of the Tea Parties. And the New York Times had an article several months ago. They had done the research. The people, the Tea Party types are much more likely to be more affluent. This is there is a real difference there. Yeah. And that's, I think, important. So, and I think that they are claiming some kind of Archie Bunker, Homer Simpson type cred for themselves, but it's not based in who they are, what they do and who they are, or anything like that. And other thing I wanted to throw in, I think that has been missing in this discussion, and perhaps there could be more of in the book, is race. What pried the white working class away from the Democratic Party in 1968? George Wallace. That's what did it. There was backlash also against the left movement, the student movement, and so on. But it was very explicitly a racial backlash. When do we get the Tea Parties with their fury about big government bailouts and stuff? Not under Bush, who swelled the government, and started the bailouts. We get them under the first black president ever, and I would say that you can't leave that out. This is not just a dialogue between white people about class, but it has to be a dialogue between whoever wants to participate also about race, because that's really what tripped up the Democratic Party.
I can't believe you were here and I was here when I heard Barbara Ehrenreich say, "Stop talking about class. Let's talk about race."
No. I think yeah, but I think maybe it's just brought home a lot more clearly to me in the last year. At the beginning of this recession, and I think then possibly the numbers have changed, black unemployment and Latino underemployment was running 3 times higher than white unemployment. The black middle class is being decimated between foreclosures and layoffs. Now, and for some reason, unemployment is always higher. So add that to the racial wealth gap, and you are really seeing the torpedoing of the black middle class that we talked about for a while. So I guess it's been on my mind a lot more. And then, of course, and I started doing some reporting about the Tea Party stuff about a year ago, and I thought, I had some of my own theories. I could not escape race. You just can't Google around in that stuff for too long without having it, hit you in the face.
Far be it from me to say that race is not one of the chief mainsprings of American politics. It is, and part of what's going on now has to do with race. On the other hand, the Tea Party is only the most recent of a whole series of infuriated movements that have been tapped by Republicans that go back to the 1970s. Now, are those folks racist? In my opinion, yes. You know what? I'm racist too. The style of racism is very different. The style of racism in professional managerial context typically talks about merit, which, by the way, places us as professional managerial people on top. The style of racism among less educated people typically talks about morality, which, in their view, places them on top. So I do think, there's racism. On the other hand, it is troubling to me to have one group of whites writing off, and I'm not saying this is what Barbara's doing, but some of the literature does, writing up another group of whites on the grounds that they're racist. I think they are racist, and I'm afraid I am too.
The same as the working class, that I'm saying. When I say, the Tea Party racism, I just distinguished the Tea Parties from the white working class.
Marjorie, do you want to jump in on this? If I may prevail on that.
Yes,
Marjorie.
Marjorie Sproul, I'm a historian at the University. Marjorie Sproul, I'm a historian at the University of South Carolina and a new fellow here. And I'm enjoying what you're talking about so very much because it overlaps a great deal with what I'm here to do this year. And some of the questions that you're asking, you have formulated better than I have been able to do for myself and struggling with this for about a dozen years. But I guess one of the things that I want to do is answer some of those questions about how it was that the white working class moved away, and when you're talking about the role that race, class, and gender played in this, I guess one of the main theses that I want to make is that in the 70s, at exactly the point that you're saying that this shift took place, that what happened was in the great national debate between feminists and social conservatives who were challenging them, that right at the time when it had at last become politically suicidal to be overtly racist, that social conservatives began to rally against anti-feminism, which they called the pro-family movement. And that's a big part of what I wanted to try to do.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that's really interesting is the way in which class anxieties have been expressed through gender traditionalism, and class conflicts have also been expressed as arguments over the proper role for women. Very few people have really thought a lot about how these various vectors of social power interact, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to do.
I see your hand over there. I just want to interject one thing. As a historian and an observer of comparative social policy, one of the things that has occurred to me is that we have to allow for change, and we have to allow for societies to become victims of their own success. So it could be that one of the reasons the working class moved away from the Democratic Party was because, in fact, the working class had become successful in moving into the middle class, or so they thought. Especially because when unions were strong and people began to really, manual laborers really began to earn, and people in manufacturing began to earn really good wages where they really were earning, men were earning a family wage. They were bringing home health insurance. They were bringing home paid vacations. They were insuring their futures with pensions and so forth. And so, they kind of moved away from this 30s Depression era mentality, and they began to think, well, maybe we don't need to keep thinking of ourselves as victims or people who need solidarity. They began to sort of buy the American dream in a certain way and think that they didn't need to protect it, and that they could sort of somehow enjoy the individualism, whatever patina, whatever, psychological goodies that brought with them. I think people began to move away from that. And then, of course, the 70s was a huge financial crisis. But by that time, they had already disengaged from the Democratic Party. I mean, I say this partly because I've also been observing what's going on in Sweden lately. With Sweden, the bastion of social democratic ethos, we never have servants, we don't have anyone taking care of us, this society will take care of us. Well, they became quite prosperous, and also their society became more ethnically and racially heterogeneous, but now suddenly they're moving away from that strong adherence to a social democratic ethos. So I think we have to allow for change. As historians, I think we probably think about this a little bit more, but that policies are formulated to address certain issues, and then sometimes they actually succeed. It's like, if I can use an analogy, it's like, in the teens and 20s, when women gave birth, it was really painful, and then they invented twilight sleep, and twilight sleep got rid of the pain of childbirth, and women didn't remember it anymore. Then, lo and behold, we have the natural childbirth movement. And everybody wants to give birth without anesthesia. Well, give us a couple of decades of that, and we're calling for the spinals, So it's, there's this kind of cyclical thing that goes on. So I think we have to, I just wanted to interject that as a historian. Over here, we had a question.
Hi, my name is Lisa Schaefer. A lot of times we talk about how we want family-friendly policies within companies. However, what I've observed family-friendly policies to actually be is that, yes, the women are allowed to be gone for their 6 weeks, or they're allowed to go on their part-time, or maybe leave early and telecommute or something, and not be around for the important meetings. But even though they're allowed to do this, they aren't allowed to get the raises and in on what's going on, the perks of what happens when they stick around. And it seems to me like it's not just the company or the corporate or even the government side that thinks that it's women's role to do all the children, the child raising and child caring. But the family and society also believes that. Why haven't we gotten to the point where we expect the same from the men? Because the men can choose, either they have, if they want, they can be part of the child raising, or, they don't, if they don't want to, they don't have to do it.
I mean, that's been an abiding question in American feminism, and I don't know what Sonia or Barbara think about it, but I mean, the book talks very, very directly to that. First of all, what you were talking about is what I've christened the flexibility stigma, is you can have flexibility, but it will be the end of your career. And the flexibility stigma really is going to persist unless and until we go back and redefine that norm of work devotion, because the flexibility stigma is what triggers when you don't live up to the norm of work devotion. The other part of your question really is, how do we change men, right? The classic American feminist answer is we bargain within the family, and get what's rightfully ours. And what the book is basically arguing is that men are under very intense gender pressures. Fatherhood is very tied up with being a provider. A lot of the structure of masculinity involves signaling in hierarchies. And one of the chief hierarchies within which men signal is the workplace. And for them to be in the workplace signaling, I have to leave because of childcare responsibilities, number one, risks the flexibility stigma, which is actually stronger for men, studies show, than it is for women. Also, it risks coming out on the short end of the stick, again, a metaphor I choose consciously, in terms of signaling masculinity on the job. Until we begin to talk to men about the gender pressures that they face and what it should mean to be a real man, I think that women are going to lose in those bargaining within the households because men are under far stronger pressures than their wife can ever put them under, that come from the workplace and come from our understandings of masculinity. Yes.
Thank you. Janine Hull in Washington, D.C. My question goes kind of to tying all of this, and particularly your comments on individualism, because it strikes me that most of us in the professional and managerial class are very close to what George Bush was accused of, being born on third base and thought he hit a triple. We are born with so many advantages, and we believe that we have gotten where we have gotten solely due to our own individual efforts and our own individual hard work, and that other people who don't achieve the same thing we do are simply slackers and people who haven't tried as hard and haven't made the sacrifices we have. And this is, you hear it a lot in the Tea Party literature and language that they use. It's, we have achieved and we have done what we needed to do to get ahead. It's all of those other people who are just leaning on us and expect us to carry them when, without them realizing that these are people who are working 2 and 3 jobs. They never see their kids. They're working their butts off, much harder than they ever worked. But that's because we have a language, going back to this lady's point, of allowing us to obscure where we get our support. Either from our communities, from our, if we're male, from our wives. There is just, it seems to me that we need a language that takes away this, I'm not going to say take away, I'm going to say that more fully describes how we achieve what we achieve, and that it's not that none of us gets there individually. George Bush was not president because of his fantastic political skills. But each of us have our own little role in that. And so I'm wondering how that kind of plays into how we're going to address this, how we're going to change the discussion, because I totally agree with you, Joan. We are not discussing. There is not a connection. There is not a conversation going on now. It is a complete breakdown of class. And part of that is because we don't, both sides don't see what is supporting us. And I just wanted to throw one last thing out. When I was in law school 300 years ago, I was given a moot court thing, and my choice was to argue on why there should be a mother's preference that was identical to veterans' preference. If we have, men are out there, and at that time it was just men, fighting for the country, making a commitment to the country. Well, my argument was that women mothers make exactly the same kind of commitment, particularly in areas where there is high infant mortality and or maternal mortality, and that kind of time out of the workforce, which is what the veterans preference is intended to make up for, is that time gone, that there should be some kind of similar recognition that of what women are providing, which is the next generation. As somebody pointed out, we're not replacing ourselves. But anyway, that's my 2 cents. But I really love this idea of a new discussion. We have to have a way that takes away, as you were talking about, the hypocrisy, but without calling it that, because I completely agree, we have to reduce the level of invective. We have to be able to treat people with respect and just understand what we're talking about, I think, more honestly. I agree with that. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I think this goes back to what you said, the lady in the tan suit back there. Yeah, you were talking, it seemed to me, about coming clean about how hard it is, like for a woman in academia or in a nonprofit. I mean, most of you probably work for nonprofits, right? And that's not no? What do you do?
And so we have some students. Yeah, we have some students.
Huh?
They hope to work. We have some
Okay,
students.
they're
They
students,
hope
but
to
you're-
work for nonprofits.
Okay, students. That means you are the pre-unemployed. You are out of yeah. But I think you were calling. You were calling for.
She's only joking.
No.
By the time you finish, there'll be jobs again.
That's. You know, I think it would be. I put it together with what you just said, that the need to say, look, this is how hard it is. This is what I'm trying to do. Not to keep pretending, as Joan is telling us, pretending to be like a man, you know, or if you're a man, pretending not to be a parent. But to be honest about that. And part of that honesty seems to me really, you know, comes to the edge of class discussions. Because when we are honest, we also acknowledge how much help we are getting from others. That I could not be here at work, say, you know, not me, myself, if there hasn't been a whole support system at home that got my laundry done and made sure there was coffee in the kitchen and everything when I went out. And then, so, you know, I find very irritating as a reluctance on the part often of professional middle-class women to acknowledge their dependency on domestics. And the men, let me not just say women, because the men are equally dependent. But to say, yeah, we do it, but we're so committed, we're really striving. What about the nanny? What about the housekeeper? What about all the other people who you may not pay directly in your lives, who are underpaid and are making it possible for you to live? That a step toward some kind of more sane society would be to be honest, and in the course of that honesty, acknowledge our many dependencies on each other, including people of other classes and other races.
And other countries. I think we have to
Other
globalize.
countries,
We have to
absolutely.
globalize
Thank
this
you, yeah.
because a lot of those people who
Well,
are
yeah,
doing
who made
that.
the clothes we're wearing?
Well, not only that, who are the nannies? Who are the domestics? A lot of them come from other countries, and they don't always come with the blessings.
The working class is very mixed in this
Right,
country
right.
now.
And they don't always have the blessings of citizenship and have to take risks.
I mean, part of that, just to add a brief note, is that I've come to believe there's no such thing as an unskilled job. I mean, are the caregivers who are taking care of a dying woman, are they unskilled? No, they're not unskilled. They're doing important work, and they're doing it with skill.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Hi, Megan Parker. I work here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where we have no paid maternity leave.
We do have childcare downstairs if you're lucky enough to get into it,
yes.
and if you can afford it.
Which you can't get into, but you had talked about the difficulty of using employment law as an avenue for this, and it occurred to me, what about public health? There are so many public health connections from the lack of good maternal leave policies or child care policies. And I don't know if that would be a more productive area. I mean, starting from women who have to go back to work too soon, to not being able to continue breastfeeding because of having to go back to work, to women like me who waited until they were of advanced maternal age, which is the exact diagnoses, which leads to higher rates of infertility, higher rates of birth defects, more impact on women's health. Is there an avenue either from the government side of public health or even from companies that are providing paid health care to seeing these more through that lens, as opposed to maybe a workers' rights avenue that has no force behind it?
Let me say, first of all, I think that we've accomplished a lot through employment law, and I just want to recognize EEOC Commissioner Stuart Ishimaru, who is the only reason we have accomplished so much through employment law. And 10 years ago, it was common knowledge and commonly accepted that if a woman was discriminated against because she was a mother, she didn't have any way to sue over it. And because of the efforts of, frankly, the Center for Work-Life Law, and with a lot of support from the EEOC, that mother now often can sue. And fathers who are prohibited from taking family leave, or in fact even discouraged from taking family leave, have always had a cause of action since 1993. Now they know it more. So I do think a lot has been achieved through employment law. I just think it's an irrational tool to have to use for this particular problem. It happens to be the only one that's worked so far. I do think that the health arguments have been underutilized. Women who work long hours have higher rates of miscarriage. Certainly the exorbitant rate in this country, that the exorbitant amount of money we pay for infertility treatments stems directly from discrimination against mothers on the job. Both direct maternal wall discrimination and the flexibility stigma, which causes people to put off having children so long that they have to have fertility treatments in order to have them. Also, we have weird working patterns in the United States. Basically, it's completely odd. The rich people work too much, and the poor people can't get enough work. And this has health effects on both. The people who work too much in this society are basically rich white men, and they pay in the form of strokes, heart attacks, all the rest of it. The people who can't get enough work, now traditionally they haven't had health insurance, so it's a new day, but traditionally they haven't had health insurance because they've only been able to get part-time hours with no health insurance, and so they have put off getting treatment until they're in crisis in the emergency room. So I think you're right. I think that we all pay a significant price in terms of poorer health because of work-family conflict and irrational work patterns.
I think, just one second, Ken. I think Megan makes a really good point, but in any normal society, those kinds of arguments should hold water. But given our history of the complexities of protective labor laws and so forth, isn't there a political danger of making those kinds of arguments? I mean, couldn't an employer say, well, we don't want to hire you because you're in your childbearing years, and we don't want to, make you defer childbearing or something like that?
So we don't want to hire white men because they have too many heart attacks?
Kent, yes.
I'm Kent Hughes at the Wilson Center as well. I was really struck by your emphasis on trying to bridge this divide by developing a language that showed mutual respect rather than kind of the elite group you described kind of looking down on the rest. And I see this in an area where there's a mixed kind of economic interest and cultural attitude. Take international trade, for instance. Almost every educated person thinks international trade is a great thing. Good for the country, good for growth, and so forth. If you talk to a group of auto workers, steel workers, a whole host of other people, they would argue they're really paying the price of that policy. Yet, if you listen to the, let's say, NPR, which is a proxy for the kind of people you're talking about at the top.
Although I love NPR.
Oh, I do too. I listen to it all the time. I learn from it. But the attitude there is, goodness gracious, how could you not be for international? Oh, you've lost your job? Well, I think there must be something that'd help with that. Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, was in a conversation, and he was arguing this point of view from the, let's say, the frontline workers sense, and the person discovered that he'd gone to Yale, and they were stunned. How could you be an educated person and raise any question about international trade? I think the same thing may affect many people with regard to large levels of low-skilled, low-wage immigration, whether legal or illegal, that it creates a competition for those low-wage, entry-level jobs that a high school student or even a high school dropout may have been able to get 10 or 15 years ago. Yet people who raise a question about that from the NPR, let's say, point of view are often denigrated as racists. They don't really understand. Why don't they like Hispanic people? That sort of thing. And I just wonder if I missed the early part of your presentation. We're all in a race to talk to foundations here. And I don't know if your book gets at that mix of where there's really an economic interest. If I'm a busy lawyer, having someone cut my grass for half the price I used to pay is great. Maybe not so good for the rest of the country.
Now, I mean, one of the points of the book is to get the professional managerial class to recognize what I call class acts, the way in which they enact their high class status. The sort of utter sureness with which some of these political positions, all of which I agree with, mind you, all of which I agree with, but the utter sureness within which these are put forward, with the message that anybody who disagrees is simply racist or stupid, I think is disserving us. Because I do think the world looks very different from different points of view. And people who ignore that do so at their peril. And I think that one of the reasons Republicans have been so good is because they know they're the business elite. They're not confused that they're representing that they are the same as the working class. They know they're an elite, and they know they have to build these bridges. And so I do think that myself and the rest of the NPR crowd, and that's who I am, I think we have to think hard about how we build bridges to people whose day-to-day lives send just very different messages than ours do. And that's where I build on Barbara's work, because she has so brilliantly shown. She's one of the only people in this entire country of 350 million, who has been able to gain the attention of the American public for what life looks like for people of a very, very different class.
Joan, I wonder if we could take advantage of I think what you bring to this discussion that's so important is your legal expertise. And you mentioned in passing a few things about labor law and so forth. And I think at one point you said that you thought employment law was not a very good tool for doing the kinds of things that need to be done. Would you argue that labor law is like the workplace has been shaped by male norms? Or could you talk about the ways in which labor law is or is not helpful to women, and how it needs to be reshaped to be more accommodating?
Well, when I wrote on Bending Gender 10 years ago, people thought, well, you can't litigate work-family conflict because it's all about choice, right? And you can't litigate work-family conflict because it's about parenthood, and parents aren't a protected class, and parents can be both men and women, so you obviously couldn't litigate in this arena. And what we did is, first of all, generated this literature with social scientists that showed that motherhood was one of the key triggers for gender stereotyping. And then we convinced first the courts, and then the EEOC adopted the court's theory that you could, when someone is discriminated against because she's a mother, that is a form of gender discrimination. That's not discrimination just based on some neutral parenthood. She is being discriminated against because she is a mother. And this was actually long before the study that showed that if you're a mother with an identical resume with someone who's not a mother, you're 80% less likely to be hired and 100% less likely to be promoted. But courts understood that. So they said, okay, now you can litigate if you're discriminated against as a mother. if you give evidence of gender stereotyping, which is actually really easy to get because people don't understand this as discrimination. So they say, well, sweetie, you had a baby, so you're fired. It's a little more subtle than that, but believe me, not more subtle than that, because the Center for Work-Life Law runs a hotline for people who have encountered family responsibilities discrimination, and you wouldn't believe the things that people say to people. And so the law has actually been made headway too for people on the flexibility stigma, although this is far more difficult. For example, one of the major cases is a case in which an African American woman filed a race discrimination complaint, and in retaliation for filing that complaint, she had her flex time schedule taken away from her. And a very conservative federal court, circuit court judge was completely outraged and said that constituted a violation of federal law because her flex schedule had been taken away from her in retaliation for doing something that was protected activity under federal employment law. There have been there was a federal case actually litigated by a former student of mine where it involved a chemist that worked 30 hours a week in a context where full-timers worked 40 hours a week. And she successfully argued that she was paid a lower wage rate than the male chemists were, and she successfully argued that was a violation of the Equal Pay Act because it was not equal pay for equal work. The employer said, well, it's not equal work, she's working a different schedule. And the court said, well, a different schedule is a different schedule. Let's look at the jobs, the content of the jobs. And if the content of the jobs is the same, this is a violation of the Equal Pay Act. So a significant amount of work has been accomplished, astonishing amount of work actually, with the help of Stewart and others in the EEOC has been accomplished in the United States through federal employment law. But federal employment law cannot give us social subsidies. It cannot give us workers' rights. It can't do that. The only way we can get those things is through legislation. And the only way we can get legislation is by very significantly shifting the political culture in the United States. Are you okay?
It's seasonal, I think.
Okay, well, I think that's a very good note to end on, a very concrete and, even though troubling, but positive note. I think we all sort of know where we need to go and what we need to do and the direction that we need to be going in. Please join us for some wine and cheese outside. Copies of the book are for sale, and Joan will be available to sign them. I think she has to make a phone call, but
at
maybe
5.
At 5. Okay, so she'll, if you purchase them quickly. Thank you all for coming.